What are XML namespaces and how do they work? We'll discuss that in today's video where we talk about XML namespaces, which are a way to identify XML vocabularies. And they're still in widespread use because XML is still in widespread use. And I think most developers at some point in their careers will get in touch with XML technologies. And it's always good to understand those technologies and how to work with them so that you can do the best things with them. What we will discuss today is we will briefly look at why do they even exist. We will look at how to use them in practice, how to use tools. We will do a little bit of hands-on exercise where I will show you that namespaces are very easy to work with and also can be very useful when you work with XML. And we will also look at some good practices. All of this is part of a series around different XML technologies. So that series has different parts. It talks about XML itself. It talks about namespaces, which is this video here. It also talks about XPath as a tool to extract information from XML documents. We will use XPath today a little bit, but I won't explain how it works. And then there's also a video about XPath 2 that goes a little bit deeper into the more sophisticated ways of how XPath has developed. I will add links to all of these videos down in the description, but let's jump right into today's topic, which are XML namespaces. Let's look at why they exist. There are two important things to consider that explain why namespaces exist. One is that it would be very useful if you could identify XML elements in a globally unique way. In the example you can see here, we have two different XML documents. One is about products, the other one is about customers, and both have a name element. One is probably the product name, the other one is the customer name. Now, if you just look at this element, it kind of looks the same. It's the name element. But it would be very useful if you could differentiate this element and say, this is the name element for products, this is the name element for customers. And namespaces are exactly that thing that allow you to do that. What you do is you declare a namespace, you use the namespace name, which is a URI, as a globally unique identifier of that namespace, where you would say this is the namespace for product elements, this is the namespace for customer elements, and then you can now uniquely identify those elements because now they are in the namespace and not just anonymous name elements where you don't quite know what the name is for. And that is important because another thing that's really popular in XML is to combine documents and to say, oh, now let's say we have a new document type that we also use internally. Let's say we export that or import that somewhere, which let's say in the product information now also includes reviews. And let's assume as part of this review, we also put in some information about the customer who submitted that review. And now you have this name element suddenly in the same document. Now it becomes even more important that you can uniquely identify the name of a product and the name of a customer. And again, this is what namespaces allow you to do, and this is what makes them so useful. And it really is something that fixes this problem, so to speak, of XML, where the XML name itself, the element or the attribute name, doesn't really mean much. It's just a label, it's just a string. And it's definitely not globally unique because it's just this simple string. And that's something that people discovered is a problem if you want to exchange data, and XML always had a very big focus on being good for data exchange. And therefore, very quickly after XML was published, there was the namespaces initiatives that said we have to add something to XML which allows us to more meaningfully talk about specific vocabularies and identify those vocabularies and then identify the elements and attributes in that vocabulary. And that's exactly what namespaces are doing. They don't really tell you how this vocabulary is defined. It could be defined in a DTD or an XML schema, but they tell you how to identify the vocabulary with the namespace name and then how to associate element and attribute names with that namespace. And that's something that in practice happens a lot. So this is an example we will use later on. This is an XML format that shows GPS data. It's called GPX. It's something that is exported, for example, from this watch. So if I record my GPS track, for example, when I go running, then the watch will export that data in GPX eventually. And GPX is interesting. We see an example here because it is this original format that has these elements that you can see there in the track segment element and then the track point element. And then in there you see that there is data for the coordinates and data for the elevation. But the original format didn't have additional capabilities of capturing data. And what happened then was that somebody created an extension, and that extension now is part of this GPS data that you can see here. And that extension now has additional elements in there for capturing the temperature, for capturing the heart rate and the cadence, so how fast you're running. And it's interesting because now somebody can use the GPX schema and say, yeah, GPX is good, but we need additional data in there. And you can now clearly separate those two vocabularies by using different namespaces, but you can still use them in the same document. And that is a very, very useful capability, and that's really exactly what namespaces were designed to do. And it's really not more. This is the important part to keep in mind. Namespaces are not more than spaces for names. Right? So a namespace is identified by URI, and it contains, so to speak, all the names that are defined for this namespace, oftentimes by schema. And these are element and attribute names. And this allows us now to have globally unique identification for element and attribute names, which makes it much easier to write robust software that clearly just works with specific elements that not just have that name, but also are from that namespace that I know they should be from. And that's really all that namespaces are doing. It's simple, but it's sometimes actually less than what people are expecting, and I think sometimes people are overthinking namespaces almost. And the way it works really is that you can associate element and attribute names with namespaces. Then the namespace itself is identified by URI. And it's also important to keep in mind that namespaces are supported by all XML technologies. They are not part of XML itself, but all XML technologies out there are based on namespaces. I really don't think that there's any XML technology that is not also based on namespaces. And the most confusing part for a lot of people is that when they see that a namespace name is a URI, they expect some magic. They expect that there has to be something at this URI. There has to be a schema. There has to be documentation. There has to be something meaningful there. And it's good if there is something meaningful there, but there doesn't have to be. The namespace name is really just that, a name. And the most important thing is that you identify, you recognize a namespace by seeing that name and saying, I know that name. My software understands this namespace, and you can identify that namespace through that URI. So ideally, let's say, you never really follow those URIs. You could, and maybe somebody was nice enough to actually put something useful there, like a documentation page or a specification document or a schema definition, whatever it may be. But that's not a requirement. The only requirement is that the namespace name has to be URI. And that's really all there is. And I think that is almost the most confusing thing for a lot of people, because we have this instinct that when we see URI, we want to copy paste it into the address bar and see what happens. That's not the best instinct with a namespace. You should mostly treat those things as just that, names. So they really are simpler than you think. They put XML names into spaces that are identified by URI. There's no way how you can really understand the namespace. That's outside the scope of the namespace spec. And mostly all you have to do is say, I know that namespace name. My software understands that namespace name. So if I write my software that it only works when it sees that namespace name, then I have robust software that doesn't process data that it shouldn't process. Now, how do you use XML namespaces? Let's just look at some of the practices and also look at a short demo. It's really simple. Namespaces are declared using XML NS attributes. So there is either the attribute just called XML NS, or it is XML NS colon and then has a prefix. And in both cases, the attribute then specifies a namespace name. So this is how you declare a namespace where a document says, I am probably using this XML namespace. And these declarations can be anywhere. They should be on the document element. That would be a good practice. We'll look into this later, but they can be anywhere. And then you can use those declarations, and this is how it works here. So when we look at this first example of how namespace declarations work, we see that there are three namespaces that are being declared. There's the default namespace, which is the XMLNS attribute. There is the foo prefix, which is the second XMLNS attribute. And then we also have a namespace declaration, which is not really best practice, but I wanted to just show you that this is possible. We also have a namespace declaration a little bit further down the document tree. So on a child element, in that case, this bar element, and that also is a namespace declaration for this third namespace. And the interesting thing here now already is that we have two elements that have the name element, but they're different elements, because the first one is from the bar namespace, which is associated with that example org ns3 namespace, and the second element, called element, is from the default namespace, which is from the example.org/ns1 namespace. So these are not the same elements, and that's the important part, that we can now safely distinguish those elements, even though they are having the same local name as it's called in XML. And what this means, this logic also is, and I put this here because I think it may be interesting to look at. This means that you can now have the same information encoded in very different ways, but it means exactly the same thing. So these three examples of XML documents mean exactly the same, even though they look quite different, because the first one uses the default namespace, the second one uses a prefix, and the third one uses a different prefix. But they all use the same namespace name. So the important things, which are the element names and the namespace names, the important things are the same in all these documents, meaning these documents mean the same, even though they look different. And this is a good test. Whenever you work with XML, you should write code that robustly would identify those three things as being identical. Because if you don't, then maybe your code works for a little while when it gets certain ways of how people encode things, and suddenly it breaks when somebody starts using a different prefix. And that always is a problem, and it shows that people haven't implemented namespace correctly. And that brings us to the most important point. So namespaces must be used by comparing URIs. So the namespace name, the URI, that's what you have to look for. The prefix really is only a local mechanism in the document to associate the element or attribute name with the declared namespace name. The prefix only has this job. It's not really relevant for the actual identification, so to speak, of which element is from which namespace. I mean, it makes this association, but in the end, right, you should just look at, do I have this element from this namespace? Yes, then this is what I want. If it's not this element from this namespace, then it's not an element I'm interested in. And that is really the most important bit, I would say. Right? Treat prefixes as an implementation detail of how XML documents work. When you process XML, always just use the local name of the element and the namespace name. And ideally, when you write XML, when you create XML, it would be nice to use maybe common prefixes for certain vocabularies, not random ones, but it shouldn't matter. But it still would be nice if you made an effort to use prefixes that are meaningful. Now let's look at a really short demo. What I have here is an example of an XML file. It's exactly the example we looked at before, which is this GPS track in the GPX format, which uses namespaces. And now I want to show you how easy it is to work with namespaces when you use the right tools. So what I'm using here is an XML editor. So it's an editor that supports XML out of the box. And it allows me to do various things. So one of the things I can do, for example, is to say, find all the elements in that document. And I won't explain how this works, but when I run this, then you will see that it has found 23,448 items. It's a big document because it's a GPS track of a run, right? And you get all these points. Doesn't matter. But what we have now is we have now looked at all the elements in the document. What we can do now is from here, we say, and for all of these elements, give me their namespace URI. We can run this and we still get 23,448 items because each of the elements is in a namespace. But when we scroll down here, then we see that, ooh, some of these namespace names are different, right? So now we already see that this document uses more than one namespace. And now you could ask yourself, okay, that's interesting. That allows me easily to find out, for example, that a document uses multiple namespaces. But let's say I want to find out how many namespaces it's using. Now I can use another handy XPath function, which is called distinct values. So this uses now this function to find distinct values of all those 23,000 elements. And now I'm down to 2 items, right? So in this big data set of 23,000 namespace names that I had found throughout the whole document, there are only 2 distinct ones. And as you can see, this now allowed me very easily to work with XML and ask a very simple question, right? And how many namespaces are used in that XML document, and what are the names of those XML documents? And I have that information very easily now because I'm working with the right tools. And this is really the one thing that I want to highlight throughout this whole series of videos, that if you just dig a little bit into XML technologies, I think it really can be a very pleasant experience to work with XML. It's just that if you, for example, then start processing documents like this with text-based tools, then things get more complicated and very brittle. So don't do that. So as you can see, working with namespaces actually is pretty simple. And let's wrap it up by a few good practices of what you should do or what you shouldn't do with XML namespaces, in particular when you are writing XML documents, you're producing them for others to consume. So ideally you should declare all namespaces on the document element, on the first element of your document. A lot of people also call it the root element, because that makes it much easier for people to immediately look at such a document and see, okay, here are all the namespace declarations. It's also nice to only declare those prefixes, or those namespaces that you are actually using in the document. That makes it also easier for people to answer this question that we were just looking at in the demo. Which namespaces are even used in this document? So that's a nice touch and makes it easier for people to work with your XML. And the last one also, I think, is a good practice to say, ideally don't just use random or generic names like namespace 1, namespace 2, namespace 3. Ideally use speaking names for your prefixes, such as the GPX prefix or the TCX, I think it was for the extension. Some kind of speaking prefix. Some vocabularies actually define a preferred prefix and say, when you use this vocabulary, please use this prefix if it's possible. And I think that's a good practice as well. And also, it's, I think, always informative to look at anti-patterns. And to make them clearer, here I have kind of violated my own rule of declaring namespaces always on the document element. Let's ignore that for now. But the things that I want to show here, the anti-patterns, are actually twofold. The first document that you see here uses the same prefix for different namespaces. Right? So it defines the prefix, but it uses the same prefix for different namespace name. First, it's the NS1 namespace name, and second, the NS2, meaning that even though the element name looks the same and even uses the same prefix, they're actually different elements because they're from different namespaces. So don't do that. That's very confusing. The second document kind of turns that around and also does something that's not good, which is that it uses different prefixes or multiple prefixes for the same namespace name. That's legal. It's also, the first example is legal. I mean, it's not wrong technically, it's just not helpful. And the second example uses different prefixes to identify the same namespace. So that makes it also confusing, because now you cannot see as clearly as you should that the two elements with the prefix 1 and prefix 2 are actually the same element from the same prefix, from the same namespace. Right? So don't do these things. Try to write software when you are producing XML that doesn't create XML output that follows these anti-patterns. And that's it. That's all that I wanted to talk about XML namespaces. I think, like I said, namespaces are actually simpler than most people think they are. And I think once you've understood how little they are, how little they do, and how to work with them with the right tooling, they're actually very easy to work with. And if you use the right tooling, really, it's no big deal to work with XML namespaces. And I think it really is important that if you do anything with XML, learn namespaces. It's not this much. I think we really discussed everything there is, so to speak. So it's not that hard. XML namespaces really are very simple, and it's something that will work for you in all XML technology. There is, as I said, I think not a single XML-based technology that is not also using namespaces. So it's really a very important foundation of the XML technology stack. And in my mind, really knowing XML namespaces and knowing how they work will make your XML life much easier. And I hope now you have that introduction. We had a little demo, so I hope that will be good enough to make your XML life easier. And with that, we're done. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you liked the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing. Check out the whole series where we have these other videos that I was talking about. And if you are interested in more API-related content, definitely also check out my YouTube channel. And you can also find me on Twitter and LinkedIn, of course. And that's it for today. So all the best, and I hope to see you soon in the other videos. Bye.